finished. I'll just introduce, I'm Claire Whitney. I'm Strategic Lead in Policy and Strategic Delivery Team and Chief Exec at Hackney Council. And I'm joined by my colleague Sue Brown, who's going to say hello, who's helping me today to do the presentation.
Hi everyone, welcome.
So what we'll do is if I can go through the presentation, and I'll try and make sure there's opportunity at the end for you to ask questions. What we'll do is we'll turn the camera off and we'll stop recording for that session, so that all that we're doing really is recording the presentation. So if you have questions, please scribble them down and keep them for the end, or if you want to, you can put them in the chat at the end and we'll try and respond to them that way. So people will keep coming into the meeting, but given the time, I think it's probably best if I can kick off, and Sue's going to help me go through the slides. And if you could just keep letting people in, Sue, because I'm going to go to my slide deck, if that's okay. So who are we? So we're just going to, in this session, we're just going to go over just a quick introduction to the grants team. Many of you will know people from the grants team. Quick overview of the community infrastructure grants themselves, purpose and aims, the eligibility, what we can't fund, the process itself, the application timetable, a bit more step-by-step guidance, and then kind of what happens next, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions to be asked. If that's okay. Okay, so on to the next slide. Thank you, Sue. During the presentation, we'll be just using different names like organisation, group. We use them interchangeably. It could be structured groups of residents or a formal organisation. VCS, voluntary and community sector, I'm sure most of you know that. Grant agreement, that's the legally binding agreement we have all organisations when we grant fund. And when we use the term request, it's your request for funding. So it's your project or your application or whatever. Next slide, please, Sue. So as I said, I'm Claire Whitney. I'm Strategic Lead. Jenny Zinau will be joining us a bit later, hopefully. And you probably do know the other members of the grants team, and it's Sue that's on the call with me now, helping me with this presentation. Next slide, Sue. So I think we just wanted to give some background and context around why the grants programme looks the way it does and what we've been doing over the last few years. So we did a big piece of engagement with the voluntary and community sector. It was a good few years ago now, must be getting up to 5 years ago. And that really identified a need to change the way that the council resources the sector. And sort of backing that up almost was what we learned over the pandemic, and subsequently what we're learning through the cost of living crisis, is the importance of collaborating and partnering in order to achieve the best outcomes for residents. So not just sort of standing back and grant funding, but actually being very collaborative in the way that we work with the voluntary and community sector. And we're on a kind of bit of a continuous journey. So as we're learning, we're changing the way we structure the grants programme, and there's still some changes to come, but we hope that we can, we'll keep you updated and informed and involve you more in the conversation. And I think there's a lot more around our strategic plan. That's so the council's got a new strategic plan. It's on the website if you wanted to have a look, and it's a linked document in some of the things that we're putting up, our own documents, so we've put a link there. So just, sorry, there's still people coming in, that's all that noise is, so it's just people as they join us. So very quickly, I don't want to spend too long on the background, but I think it is quite important. So if we go on to the next slide. The strategic plan, you'll probably see more of this because this is our strategic plan as a council for the next 4 years. And what we've done is we've captured the Mayor's visions and priorities into our strategic plan. And I think really key to what's in there is the commitment to working with our communities and our partners to tackle the sort of really difficult and almost unprecedented challenges we face. We thought when austerity was introduced that things were hard, but this is really difficult environment that we're working in, and we know that we have to make quite transformational change. We know we need to co-produce and co-design solutions with our residents. We campaign hard for a better deal for Hackney, but it's not going to get any easier. But that doesn't mean we don't want to still continue to do a really good job. And that's why we have a strategic plan, because despite the very challenging environment we're in, Hackney still wants to do the best it can for the residents. We know that the VCS is well placed in its ability to reach and work with some of our most disadvantaged and vulnerable residents. And so you're often best placed to provide a service or to ensure that other services are being accessed by people. And we want to ensure that the funding for the sector is best deployed to fully realise those strengths of the sector. So the priorities of the grants programme supports the wider agenda of the council and our priorities as our council, with a focus upon that sort of intervention and prevention and building resilience within communities, which we know the voluntary and community sector is really best placed to do. And trying to respond to that, to enable that, we're starting to deploy our resources in a more strategic way. We're using context more, so we're not just looking at kind of the project that's submitted or how good an application form is. We're looking at the context of Hackney and what we need to fund. And we're also trying to use funding in a way that influences the wider system. So we're trying to do things that will help people, colleagues across the council, plus across other big partner organisations, to perhaps kind of, where it makes sense, move from commissioning to grant focus, to grant funding. We're putting more focus on early help and prevention, and also trying to encourage funding that doesn't constrain the voluntary and community sector, but really enables organisations to use their expertise and knowledge. And I'll say a little bit more about that in the next slide. But as I said, there is a link in the guidance documents that we have on our website to the council strategic plan. And if you do have time, it's worth having a look, particularly at the last section on ways of working. So there's 4 sections in the strategic plan. And if you don't have time to read all of it, have a look at the last section, because that's really important in terms of the way the council works with our partners, residents and the voluntary and community sector. So if you could go on to the next slide, please, Sue. So in terms of the grants programme longer term, we're very much investing in responding to the cost of living crisis at the moment, and that's likely to continue. And also in the way that, and thinking about how we need to transform and what public services are going to look like in the future. So as I said, it's allowing the VCS to adapt and develop and enhance their service offers. We were very focused, we're an anti-racist council, so we're having to focus about looking at everything we're doing in terms of through an anti-racist lens. There's an understanding that we've got to support the sector in terms of building capacity and nurturing leadership. And we do recognise the importance of that community action at a local level, and how that's important in terms of community resilience. So I won't keep, you can read that. There is a kind of a longer term vision about what we're doing through the grants programme that isn't just about, handing funding projects and short-term interventions. We're actually trying to look more longer term and more strategically about how we use the council's grant programme and the investment to support the sector and therefore our residents. So if you want to go on to the next slide, Sue. We've slightly changed, these will probably look familiar to you, but they have been slightly changed. They are the programme priorities, and they're similar to the ones before. We've just slightly amended them to be more aligned to the council's new strategic plan that I've already mentioned. So these are the 2 overarching programme priorities that everything we're doing within the grants programme, this is what we're trying to achieve. This is the kind of headline of what we're trying to achieve through the grants programme. So what we're here for is the community infrastructure. So I'm just going to, Sue, if you could go on to the next slide, I want to spend a little bit more time and slow down a bit, because I'm sure this is the bit that everybody's really interested in and why you've come along today. So we introduced community infrastructure grants last year, and what this is doing is building on last year's programme. And what this funding is core funding, and the focus really is to enable the voluntary and community sector to continue to be able to collaborate with each other and the council to best help residents. And that's what we kind of knew we needed to start doing when we were writing the voluntary and community sector strategy. The sector was very clear about what was needed. But I think we only experienced that when we went into the pandemic and we were faced with a crisis and we had no alternative really but to really collaborate and work very closely with partners in the voluntary and community sector, because we had no choice. We had to protect residents, we had to keep them safe, and we learnt very quickly the power of doing that and how essential that is to actually supporting residents who most need help. So the programme's 3 years. We've already had the first year, so the grants that are going to be awarded from April are 2-year grants to put them in line with the 3-year programme, and they're of up to 19,800, and that depends really upon, we've given a standard grant unless your turnover is your annual turnover is very small, in which case it will be proportioned to whatever your annual turnover was, but as long as your annual turnover is above 50% of that, then you'd get the full grant. There are 2 stages to the application. So one's going to be a written application and the second part of it is going to be an interview. And you can be based in and serve a particular area of the borough. So you can be that kind of community infrastructure that is very geographical and locally based. You could be community led by a particular community, or you might be both. And sometimes that's the case. What we're really interested in is how you meet the holistic needs of residents and their families, and that's through the relationships you have with them. How you collaborate with other services, including statutory and other VCS organisations, and also where you have those relationships of trust that our services cannot reach. So those are the sort of 3 key things that these grants are focused upon. If you go to the next slide, Sue. So what do we mean by community infrastructure? And it's an odd name, and it means different things to different people and organisations. But I suppose for us, it's how we learn and we saw, especially during the pandemic and subsequently through the cost of living crisis, how organisations use their expertise and knowledge of the particular communities they're working with, whether that's geographical or ethnicity or religion, whatever, is the person-centred ways of working that builds a lot of trust with residents and enables very significant outcomes over time for people requiring support that is outside of an organisation's everyday services or projects. And what we mean by that is we know that primarily organisations are funded to do a particular thing, and that's completely understandable, but we know that some organisations have recognised that they have to go beyond that, because without doing that they can't provide the support that people need. And this is very difficult to put into a commission or a procurement process, or even to specify it within a grants programme, because it's very responsive to the individual who walks through the door. And what we learned through the pandemic was that all of these organisations we'd been working with for some time, who were doing all sorts of different, youth organisations or supplementary schools or all sorts of different organisations, in addition to the actual service they were providing, they were doing all of this work in the background, if you like, that really provided a significant amount of support for individuals, irrespective of what their need was. And that's what's, for us, is gold dust and was so important during the pandemic and is really important now. And it's just making sure that we're working with those organisations and that we're funding them to continue doing that, but also to work with us. Ultimately, we know through the work we did during the pandemic that that sort of work with organisations that can engage with and reach residents who are furthest from our services can help reduce the pressures on statutory services. And we know that organisations that have put a lot of time and energy into collaborating with each other and with the council, through those connections and networks and relationships, can provide really good help for residents. So that's what we mean when we describe a community infrastructure organisation. What it's not, which I have been asked and I put this in there, is it's not campaign, second tier or umbrella organisation or pan-London activity. It's not kind of second tier infrastructure. It's a different sort of community-based infrastructure. You have the next slide, please, Sue. So what we've learned over the last year, this is just something a colleague said to me that I thought was quite useful and thought I'd drop it into the presentation, because we were talking about what do we mean by community infrastructure. And what they said is, we have seen that by having meaningful and sustained relationships with residents they support, 20 organisations have been well placed to address the variety of challenges in someone's life. This work is often unseen and uncounted, but has incredible impact for residents and isn't something statutory services can provide. So I thought that was a really good description from somebody who's been working with these organisations, the 20 organisations we've already been funding. So next slide, please, Sue. So should your organisation apply? The first thing I'm going to say, and I'll say it again later on, we're only able to fund 5 organisations through this for this round, which isn't many. So it's going to be hugely competitive. And so I would really have a good look at the criteria in the application form before you make the decision to apply. Because if you're not really in that space, I wouldn't apply, because there's only going to be 5 funded. And so you really have to recognise yourself instantly as a community infrastructure organisation. Otherwise, it's probably not in your interest to apply. So the criteria in the application and the example case studies should help to make it easy for you to see if you're an organisation that would be considered for the grant. You should be able to easily answer. It shouldn't be a struggle to answer the questions in stage 1, and you should have just so many examples dripping off your tongue that you know you're not having to really work hard to evidence this. We know that due to structural inequalities and racism, there's not a level playing field. And so when we look at stage 1, we are considering that, although we do have to also consider that some organisations need a lot more support from us, and there is very limited capacity to do that. So we're also having to take that into consideration. Next slide, Sue. Sorry, it's quite long, this presentation. I'll zip through this bit because this is the bit that is standard to all of our applications, and you're probably quite familiar with if you've applied for grants before. So there is application eligibility that you need to really, just check through it, make sure that you're eligible to apply. Next slide, please, Sue. This just describes the sorts of organisations. So in terms of eligibility, what do we mean by registered organisations and structured groups of residents? And if you don't, and you can always contact the community partnerships team, because they're always really happy to help. If rather than you fill in an application form and you're not an eligible organisation, please do contact the team and they'll let you know. So that's just a description of eligible organisations. Next one, please, Sue. Here's a list, again, probably very familiar, what we can't fund. So if you had any, it's worth having a look through this, just to make sure you're not including anything in your application form that we can't actually fund, because then we'd have to exclude it. Next one, please, Sue. So application forms, they're open at the moment for the community infrastructure grants. They close on the 24th of April at 5 o'clock. Make sure, please, if you're going to apply, make sure you put it in before then. The deadline is the deadline. We can't allow anybody to apply after that. And there's always lots of reasons why people say their application form was in late, but that's our deadline, and it's not fair for us to accept late applications. So please try and get it in before then. We'll do some shortlisting, and then we'll come back to those that we've shortlisted and ask them if they would attend an interview. So we'll be worth keeping some dates clear. And then we'll have a decision-making panel the first week in June, and we should be able to notify people if they're successful in the second week in June. So next slide, please. So we don't accept any paper applications. You do need to apply online. And if you go onto the council's website, all of this information is on there, and the links to making the applications through our portal. If there are any new questions in the guidance, so if you've kind of read it last year and you're just reading it through quickly, they're always highlighted. So anything that you might not be familiar with has been highlighted in red in all of the guidance for all of the grants for 23-24. Okay, so next one. And then there's a whole section, so I'm just going to be really quick, section about so the section 1 is about your organisation. Should take about 20 minutes to complete, and it will all be quite familiar to you if you've applied for one of Hackney's grants before. Next slide, please. This again about beneficiaries, we're always interested in, we need to understand who the beneficiaries are for your projects. Next slide, Sue. And that this one is section 3 is about us helping us to understand how you'd use the grant, both financially, i.e. what would the direct spend be, but also what other benefit would come through having the funding that wouldn't necessarily about something you actually financially paid out for, but would provide opportunities. So anything you want to express in that part goes into section 3. And next slide, please, Sue. God, we're almost at 30:30. Section 4. So section 4 is the bit where you actually start doing the bit which is around the community infrastructure grant. It should take around 3 hours to complete the section thoroughly. There's 3 sections. There's 3 questions that you'll need to answer. You need to be really, take your time and answer them. And as I said before, if you're a community infrastructure organisation, this shouldn't be a difficult question to be answered. You shouldn't having to be contorting yourselves to answer these questions. It should be fairly straightforward. You can add up to 2 case studies. We would recommend case studies because I think with the community infrastructure grants, they really help to evidence the sort of work that you do. You don't have to put them in, but I think they're just good for you to be able to evidence things. And it is a top tip. We say this to around all of the grant applications. Find someone who has little or no knowledge about your work if you can, and ask them to read over these sections. Because if they're not understanding what you're trying to say, the assessors who are assessing for us, they probably won't be able to either. So that is a top tip for any grant you're applying for from Hackney. And next slide. So these are the actual questions. There's some guidance with this, and to help you answer these 3 questions in the guidance. So it's worth having a look. So for example, this question is, we want to know about any additional work that your organisation does to support the residents you work with. And there's essential and additional criteria in the guidance, so that you need to refer back to that so that you're describing what we're looking for. And there's some guidance so that, because I think to help you answer these questions, you really need to understand what we're looking for, because we got a lot of application forms where we could see that people hadn't read the essential and additional criteria in the guidance document. So they were kind of not answering the question. So please read that, refer to it. So this first question, we know that there's going to be constraints on funding, and so that you can't always sort of address the challenges and barriers that the residents you work with face, but you can describe here what you've tried to do to help them deal with this. What have you been able to do directly with residents to overcome challenges, and what have you been able to achieve by themselves? And how's your relationship and understanding of a resident helped you to provide the right sort of support? And what we're talking about here, which is a bit, I think this is a bit that's quite difficult for some organisations to understand, is that this is not about what your organisation does and why it exists, which is why we say you've already told us about that. And this is not about the work you're delivering every day and the way in which you deliver it. This is about those organisations that will deliver a service, but actually do lots and lots of work in the background with those families that isn't really part of their core service delivery at all. They just recognise that unless they're able to do that work, they're not really able to deliver their core service. And that's really hard because lots of organisations aren't funded to do that. They're funded to do their core work, their youth activity or their, physical activity for older people, whatever it is. So this is about telling us about the bits that you're doing to help families that isn't really part of your core, your service delivery, but you recognising you're having to do often because of the cost of living crisis. You go on to the next slide, please, Sue. This is about us understanding your expertise and knowledge, which is the one of the key reasons why we're so keen to work with the voluntary and community sector, because you have expertise and knowledge that means that residents will come to you and they won't go anywhere else for help. We know that the expertise and knowledge that sits in the voluntary community sector reduces inequalities for the residents that you work with. And we know that you're able to provide good help that recognises that, good help is complex and is different for every person that might walk through the door because people need different things. And also sort of this is an opportunity to say, well, sometimes you don't have the expertise and knowledge, but you recognise when you don't, and you bring in the support of another organisation. Next question, please. Next slide, sorry, please, Sue. And this is particularly important. Again, all three questions, really important. The importance of ability to collaborate and partner, because that's as I said before, one of the big things we learn is that what really works is because not an organisation on its own, especially our smaller local organisations, can't provide all the solutions for the complex challenges facing the residents they work with. They have to collaborate and partner, and we're really interested in that. We need to understand why you've collaborated and created partnerships with other organisations and how they help you to help the residents you work with, solve the problems in their lives and overcome some of the challenges they're facing. Nearly there. Section 5 is just the attachments. Again, very familiar to anybody who's applied for a grant. This is the bit where you upload all your documentation. Next slide, please, Sue. And then the final one is your declaration. So that's the application form. How we will assess stage 1. So we're going to, as I said, we're anticipating we're going to receive a lot of applications for this, and we can only fund 5 organisations maximum. So if you can't easily answer those 3 questions, once you've read through the essential criteria and you've read right the way through all the guidance, if you don't think you can really easily answer those 3 questions, I would walk away from this application form, because we're only funding 5 organisations. But if you recognise your organisation and you think this is going to be easy, I'm going to be able to answer these questions, I wish I had more, I wish I had more than 600 words or whatever it is, then I would recommend that you do apply. They're all of equal importance, the questions. But please try to demonstrate in the answers how your organisations has the characteristics we're looking for. We've got, again, lots of applications saying, describing the service that is delivered, but not the ways in which the organisation worked and the ways in which the organisation worked with residents. So as well as your application form is really important. We will be reading the application forms and assessing. But I think what's really important to understand is we will also be using context, and we're using context increasingly for our grants, because what we have to do is look at where we already, and the context for this, for example, will be where we already have funded community infrastructure organisations that are supporting particular communities. We also look at context as Hackney as a whole and the challenges facing Hackney, particularly poverty and inequality. And we're also looking at geographical. And we're not going to say that we're going to be able to fill all of these gaps because the funding we have isn't enough. But it's not just about the application form. We have to use that context in terms of our decision making. Next slide, please, Sue. We'll have a panel that will assess all the application. We'll include partners from the VCS because we found their insight really helpful and useful. We'll then invite organisations to stage 2 interview, and we'll offer unsuccessful feedback on unsuccessful applications if you want it. Sorry, I'm trying to get through because I want some time for questions. So there's links. Please do look at our website. There's all sorts of documents that will help you in your application for this grant and other grants. And there's also details of support. If you could go on to the next slide, Sue. There's all the additional support. So you can contact, as I said before, our community partnerships team. Hackney CVS are a funded organisation, so they can help you with your application forms, and Alba are also a partner we work with in terms of that additional support. So I'm going to stop there because I'm aware that it's a really long presentation, and so if you can stop recording and we'll take questions.